Alright guys, talk about the Formula 1 news. Mercedes are starting to admit just why every F1 team this year, apart from themselves, has Mercedes as their heavy pre-season favourites. George Russell backtracks on some of his earlier comments about the huge advantage that apparently Red Bull had in energy deployment. If they still do have an edge, it is by no means as significant as Mercedes initially had us believe, and going into Melbourne, every team believes that it'll be either George Russell or Kimi Antonelli taking the checkered flag first, despite Ferrari, among others, recent strong performance. But there's a long time, arguably, between now and Melbourne for teams to make improvements and changes. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Phenomenal couple of photos here yesterday, I think out of San Francisco, where this was Yuki Tsunoda's car catching fire. So he hit some donuts in one of these old Red Bulls. Just, promotional event, you guys know how it goes. But people were telling him, like, Yuki, your car's on fire, because he wasn't really meant to know. You can see the crowd here was telling Yuki to get out the car. Eventually he does, and he steps out rather calmly. Look, he's been here before. But it did produce some absolutely phenomenal pictures, this being one of them, and I think there's another one as well, actually, here as well. So some pretty fire ones, I'm not going to lie. This one was probably the gold standard. This could be Drive to Survive imagery, cover imagery for the season. Unfortunately, Yuki isn't in the car anymore. It is what it is. Word to Mr. Yuki Suzuki in the comments. Now, the other funny thing about this event was this is Scott Speed, old school Red Bull driver, American driver, of course. He is, he hits a little donut here and then kind of inexplicably just rams it straight into the wall. So I don't really know what happened there. Anyway, that was a talking point of the day. F1 also put this out. Course, it's nice and sunny right now out in Melbourne for the Australian Grand Prix. They're putting together the finishing touches for the start of the season, so it's not far now until all of our questions are officially going to be answered. What we also want to know, can Aston Martin make any progress? There's no doubt that on paper they have an exciting team, an exciting proposition. Adrian Newey has come up with some clearly very interesting ideas. Yeah, other teams have interesting ideas as well, but in terms of a conceptual design, the Aston is one of the most interesting, extreme, aggressive that we have seen on the grid. It's a shame that we might not see it finish the first race of the season. That's how things currently look. There's so many issues to be resolved. Now look, they will make progress for sure. It's a matter of time, and it's also a matter of whether their ultimate ceiling is actually going to be that high with this power unit. But the discussion is, there's so many issues, durability, gearbox, cooling, drivability, and they haven't even been able to start really thinking about performance. Especially funny today was when Fernando Alonso was spotted in the passenger seat of a Toyota Yaris. So, he at least wanted something that was going to be reliable for the last few days. How much progress can Aston Martin make in the next couple of weeks before Melbourne? It's a week and a half, really, at this point, before everything is travelling out there and getting ready to go. New parts are expected to arrive for both the chassis and the engine in Australia. Not all issues, though, are meant to be resolved. The race do say that there's a good chance that by the start of the season, they are in a better spot. We don't believe the Aston is the slowest car, and perhaps it should make the biggest leap from testing, but of course it's leaping from a disastrous baseline, right? Testing, they were the worst team at testing. Nobody is disputing that, even behind Cadillac. Can they get better? Yes. Will they get better? Sure. It's a matter of time, and it's a matter of what the ultimate ceiling of this prospect really is. But now it has the worst reliability, one of the slowest packages, and is a long way from being ready. The latest discussion as of today is that, presumably understandably, this is a pretty big wake-up call for Honda. I mean, they should have probably had this one already. But Honda now realise, okay, there's a fair bit of work to do. Will they ever, with the team that they have, be able to get to the level they need? It was an ambitious undertaking for Aston Martin to choose Honda as their power unit supplier. On paper, it made sense because of the Red Bull partnership, but they were meant to be out of the sport. They shut everything down, Honda, when it came to F1 engine development. Pretty much all of their top guys went to Red Bull powertrains, among others. Then they started to spin it up again, arguably a very different proposition. And yeah, obviously Aston wanted to be a works team and to have a sole partnership. Audi were coming in with their own engine. They didn't want to rely on Mercedes too much longer. Understandable. But equally, one does have to wonder where they might be if they did have a Mercedes engine this season with a newly designed car, because maybe this is the way to go. If Aston want to be winning championships in the coming years, I mean, this year was going to be ideal, but clearly that's not going to happen on current evidence anyway. This is probably the way to go. Just maybe partnering with Honda in the circumstances might not have been the wisest call. Who knows how we'll look back on this in 5 years' time. But Honda apparently have said, okay, guys, yep. Our engine sucks, we can't charge the battery breaks for some reason because of the way that the MG UK is working, or there's some sort of issue anyway. The other feeling to mention is that Honda, they nailed it with the MGUH, so that which recovered heat energy from the turbo and other things, I think. That was the key component that Honda really got right in the previous era. Their MG UK was good as well, and their energy recovery was solid, but there was the feeling that Honda really nailed it with the MGUH. It just wasn't an especially commercially viable, as in from a public-facing perspective, the MGUH was not a piece of technology which found its way into too many road cars. So that was one of the reasons why it was canned, despite being very interesting tech. And now the teams have not been able to rely on that at all for any of their energy recovery this season. Now that has changed a few things, one of which it's reducing some of the experience and expertise that Honda had in that domain. But they say that they are expecting to find a solution to the major technical problems by the Chinese Grand Prix. So they are effectively writing off Australia. I think there is a very good chance that neither driver even finishes that race. I mean, they've not been able to string together 50 laps, even 30 laps in testing. So what makes us think they can do it when the race starts? Look, these engineers, these technicians, they are some of the smartest people on the planet, certainly working in the sporting domain. They will find solutions. Whether they can do that in time, that's a different conversation. Aston are now talking about China being, that might be the start of the turnaround, and then from race 6 or 7, I think it's race 7 after race 6, that's where they can introduce a new homologation if they are substantially behind the power unit leaders, which is likely to be Mercedes, especially now George Russell has backtracked to a degree, and we'll discuss that in a second. That's the Aston Martin situation. They're confident they may have turned a corner on this one, but again, Aston were talking about, it's all about 2026. That's what we're sacrificing for. 2026 comes around, it's a bit of a shambles so far. Now the talk is, well, 6 was just a learning year, it's all about 2027, etc. So is this quickly but going to become, okay, yeah, we're going to find a solution in China to, oh no, we were never really intending to make the car better in China, it was just we were trying to introduce this thing. Then it will be, okay, hopefully by Abu Dhabi we'll have a car that actually can do a lap. I'm sure they will have that. It shows that F1 is a difficult sport, right? You can have your huge facility, you can have your huge factory, but with all the moving parts here, someone was going to cock up, and well, on this occasion it was Aston Martin. They are, according to Albert Fabrega, 10th, not 11th. So this is the ranking that Albert Fabrega has. We saw a similar ranking from the guys at Sky Sports. They had Mercedes first, then McLaren as well, then Ferrari, then Red Bull, then Alpine, then Haas, then the others were in a kind of similar-ish order. But this is pretty much what you will get. Yes, Cadillac probably have the slowest car aerodynamically. Actually, I'm certain that they do. But in terms of overall package, Aston Martin have had the weakest test so far, that's for sure. Williams, I think, have been very disappointing, right? Now, a lot of that is the weight of the car. It is massively overweight as far as we understand. They didn't make it to Barcelona in time. But I think that Williams fans were certainly hoping for more, right? Like, after last season, getting the couple of podiums, I think there was a real feeling this year, even myself included, that, well, this Mercedes engine might be so strong that it just doesn't matter about Ferrari and Red Bull or whatever, because it's going to be Mercedes, McLaren, Williams, Alpine all the time. Not the case, as we understand. Williams don't seem to be particularly near the pecking order, at least at the top end of the midfield. Alpine certainly are. They could well be best of the rest, and it's difficult to split the other four. In fact, across the date of the Bahrain test, the rankings across the top four varied wildly as time went on. The race also give their ranking, which is similar. Aston in 11th, Cadillac in 10th. Then Williams, Audi, Racing Bulls, Alpine, Haas. So very similar to what we have seen elsewhere. Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. So some are swapping these around, but I don't think I've seen many people have Red Bull much higher than third. Certainly no one's got them seconds. Red Bull are mostly considered to be the fourth most competitive team. Again, I still think that even with this new era of cars and lots to learn from all the drivers' perspective, I still think we are probably going to have a Red Bull Max and then a Red Bull second driver, right? And sometimes that goes into the rankings as to, okay, well, Max's Red Bull might be here, the second car might be expected to be here. But this year should be better for the second driver anyway, just because the field is going to be less competitive. There's a feeling that the closest Haas, Alpine and the rest can hope to be to the pole time in Australia is a second off. If Haas are a second off, if Williams, if all these other teams are a second off the pole time in Australia, they will have done a great job, I think, and they will be very happy. So if you are Red Bull and you're, let's say, 3/10 off pole, Hadjar's only got to be within 7/10 of Max and he's going to qualify in the top 8. In theory, right? Obviously, it's all theory, but when the gaps are bigger between the teams, as they certainly will be this year, and we've seen that already, then it shouldn't be as bad to be a Red Bull second driver as has been the case in the past. But in terms of competing, it's more than likely Max that will be doing the damage, if anyone. But it is interesting because Ferrari, as we talked about at length in recent days, made massive progress during the test, looked like a very competitive outfit, brought some very innovative upgrades and solutions as well, but no one has them favourites. Some people have them second, some have them third, no lower than that really, but no one has got Ferrari being the favourites for the first race, which is interesting, but the teams are on board with this, and Andrea Stella says McLaren, Red Bull, probably very similar, Ferrari and Mercedes a step ahead. Again, our understanding is that all the teams think that Mercedes have this in the bag. To a degree, I still think it should be competitive, but the teams are fearing that Mercedes have been sandbagging to a great extent. My gut feel is that that is what has been going on here for political, among other reasons that we have seen so far. It does feel like a kind of classic old Mercedes test when they have far more performance than they're necessarily willing to show us. But Stella admits that they're a step behind, Ferrari and Mercedes a step ahead, but there's still a lot of work to be done from all of these teams, and arguably from Ferrari to get to where Mercedes are as it stands, at least from a power unit perspective. Now, let's not forget, on the first day of the first Bahrain test, George Russell was adamant that it was a Red Bull who had the best package and that they were the favourites. Now, as the test went on, that became less clear by any means. I will say, the very first day of the test, Verstappen hit 344 kph at the end of the straight. He never hit that number again, nor did anybody else. So one argument is, well, they were turning the engine down, right? So that they wouldn't show their true hands. Because it felt like at the end of that first straight in Bahrain, Red Bull just had a way more deployment than anybody else did. That seems true for a day or two, but then other teams caught up and found other ways. My opinion on why Verstappen never reached that top speed again was not because Red Bull decided to sandbag because George Russell said that they were the favourites, but because they found a better way of managing the energy. The teams believed that there was half a second to be found over the course of the week, the 2 weeks, by just deciding more intelligently where to use the energy and where to harvest. So, my opinion is that Red Bull realised that using all that juice at the end of the straight actually wasn't the most efficient way to deploy the energy, which is why they did it a different way. But all the teams agreed on the first day of the test that, wow, Red Bull's deployment is very impressive, consistently lap after lap. We can't compete with that. By the end of the test, however, there was a different story. George Russell said, and the race pointed this out in their video, and there's an Autosport article talking about similarly, the Mercedes power teams have made a lot of improvements since the first day of Bahrain. The deployment gap has closed drastically. So, Russell was all song and dance about Red Bull being the best by a long way, and there's no way, Max is driving well. Even Toto was saying the same thing. It's like, we can't compete with their energy deployment and their recovery, it's just way too good. And then by the end of the test, Russell is saying, well, I wasn't wrong, but the gap is now drastically closed. And that's interesting, right? Because usually the teams will say, oh yeah, well, we improved, but we don't know what the other guys are doing. Maybe maybe they've also got more in the tank and all this. But it doesn't seem like Russell thinks that. Russell seems confident that, yeah, Red Bull are kind of where they were at the start of the test. They learned, but they were closer to their ceiling in terms of their energy deployment. Mercedes have got better, the Mercedes power teams have got better, and now we're basically right there, was the implication. So if that was the real edge that Red Bull had, was their deployment, and probably their ICE isn't as strong as the Mercedes, and probably their integration might not be as good as we see from Mercedes, who knows. It's pretty clear to see that Mercedes have done a fair bit of moving in silence here. When it wasn't silence, they were actually deflecting a lot when there was all the compression ratio drama. It now appears that the rival teams might even vote down a proposed solution to that problem. So I think as the test went on, Mercedes felt that they were more and more comfortable in their position as being certainly in the mix. That's what they would say, but people consider them to be the favourites. Now, speaking of energy deployment, I think it's definitely worth noting here that Bahrain, of the circuits on the calendar, was, I would argue, even one of the better circuits for energy recovery. These are the circuits here in 2026. Sakir is Bahrain, as you can see. Big braking zone turn 1, pretty good braking zone turn 4, decent braking zone towards the end of the middle of the second sector. Again, quite a lot of big braking zones within reason. Some circuits, though, that is not the case for. Melbourne is one of them, right? What you really don't want for your battery are long straights and then fast corners between said straights. The back part of Melbourne is going to be horrific for recharge, right? There's a couple of corners like turn 7 which are going to have a little bit of recharge, but fundamentally you're flat out down the back straight and then you barrel through a massive left-right chicane at pretty much 150 miles an hour and you're not going to be recharging there. Yeah, you'll recharge at the end of that straight, but then even the final sector doesn't give too many opportunities. So Melbourne will be tough on battery, and I think whatever the differences are, if there still are any, between energy deployments, between Mercedes and Red Bull or whatever, I think we are probably going to get to see that. Jeddah might be the worst of any circuit. I don't know what circuit's going to be the worst for this. Monaco will be fine. They're going to have a tough time even getting up to the speeds required to use all the energy there. But Jeddah, I mean, yes, wow. Again, it's a similar type of thing, right? Massive long straight separated by fast corners. So not much deployment opportunities or not much recharge opportunities, plenty of deployments. There's a big braking zone at the end of the lap and, of course, at the end of the first sector. But even then, it's big braking zones, but also the corners aren't super tight. They're not getting down to massively low speed in those corners. It's the highest speed track on the calendar. So Jeddah will be a problem. Montreal, a couple of corners that work, but not much. I mean, again, Montreal does have a fair few fast chicanes in there, so Montreal's going to be a challenge on energy. I think just compare some of these circuits I'm mentioning here to Bahrain, and you can quite clearly see that actually Bahrain is good on energy deployment compared to many. Jeddah, Montreal, even Silverstone, really, because there's not too many particularly heavy braking zones apart from right at the end of the lap towards Club. Apart from that, there are some others in the loop, but it's not great. Of course, Monza would... I mean, I said Jeddah was the worst. I guess it's got to be Monza, hasn't it, really? Obviously, there is the heavy braking zone for turn 1. But then you've got the second chicane is higher speed. The two Lesmo corners are taken pretty high speed. The Ascari chicanes, like, very high speed. So, yeah, that's going to be a tough circuit. I guess we'll see, but the point is that, yeah, energy deployment is not going away as a major conversation topic. Again, the key decider of the pecking order is going to be, yes, Mercedes were holding back. Everyone knows it. They were turning the engine down. They didn't even do a race sim because they're kind of maybe they're even fearful that they're so far ahead they don't want to show it, like we saw back in 2014. I don't think it's going to be anything to that extent, but the question that will probably determine whether Mercedes really do win Australia and dominate the season is how much Ferrari and Red Bull also held back performance. They certainly did hold back performance. The question is, did they hold back as much as Mercedes, or more or less? In Ferrari's case, we think probably yes, based on the great lap time that Leclerc did on the final day. McLaren is pretty interesting because they've got Mercedes power. They're going to enjoy an engine upgrade, we think, because of the latest specification that Mercedes are forced to give them in Australia. but they're not going to bring any massive changes to their car, right? So this is an understanding for some time now that McLaren, the spec that they tested with, is going to be basically the same car as they're going to turn up to Melbourne. Other teams, they will look to bring more aggressive upgrades early on. McLaren aren't so keen on that idea. So let's say aerodynamically, what we saw from McLaren in Bahrain is probably what we're going to see in Australia. And it wasn't slow, it was actually pretty fast, but maybe not quite as fast as they need to get away with no major upgrade in the immediate future. But very much enjoyed your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.